Welcome back to the Human Perspective. My name is Judy Human, and I am a white 74-year-old disabled woman with brown hair and red glasses. I'm wearing a lilac sweater. I sit in a wheelchair and we're in the foyer of our home with lots of photos. Cheri, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Judy. My name is Cheri Blauwet. I am a Caucasian woman. I have brown hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing a green blouse with a black necklace, sitting in my wheelchair in my office at the hospital where I work.
And you're a Dr. Cheri Blauwet, right?
True. Yes, Dr. Cheri Blauwet.
And Ann Cody, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'd love that. I'm Ann, and I'm a Caucasian woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and blue eyes, and I have tortoiseshell covered glasses on. I'm wearing a black blazer with a bright blue shirt, and I'm sitting in my office, and there's a photo of Paralympic fencers from the 2012 London Paralympic Games behind me.
Thank you very much for coming. And I think everybody will find that both of these women have very rich lives that are interesting for people to learn about and to look at emulating. Ann and Cheri, you're both Paralympic medalists who played on the United States team for 3 Paralympic Games. Let's start by having each of you introduce yourselves to the audience with a little bit more background about who you are. Ann, you've been in Paralympics longer, so why don't you start?
That's very kind of you. So, yes, I competed in the 1984 Paralympic Games on the women's wheelchair basketball team for the U.S. Then I went on to the 1988 Games in Seoul and the 1992 Games in Barcelona, where I competed in wheelchair racing on the track. That's where I've earned my 6 medals.
Could you also talk with us about when you acquired your disability?
Sure, be happy to. I acquired my disability when I was 16 years old. I was in high school. I was a junior in high school. I was already a competitive athlete. I wanted to play field hockey at the collegiate level. That was my goal. And then when I acquired my disability, I immediately, felt a loss, right? Because sport was such a huge part of my life. So I started asking about what opportunities might be available at the collegiate level for me. And there was only one university at that time that actually had a program where women could have competitive collegiate careers, and that was at the University of Illinois.
What year was this?
1981, when I started at the U of I, as we call it. And I played on the women's wheelchair basketball team there, and also made the national team. But I pursued track and road racing, wheelchair track and road racing in the off season, and did some competitive track and field meets. Initially I wasn't really sold on the sport, and I wasn't enjoying it because I didn't have equipment that fit me. And so anyway, so it took me a while to really, adapt to the idea of being a wheelchair racer. But once I did, I fully committed, and then was selected for the 1988 Paralympic team and the Olympic exhibition event for women wheelchair racers. And then in 1992, again, I made the U.S. team in track and field for wheelchair racing.
Did you know anything about the Paralympics while you were in high school?
Nothing. When I was in rehab, when I was in rehabilitation, the nurses told me about a local Paralympian from Syracuse who was a swimmer. So they knew about the Paralympic Games and that there were competition opportunities, at the international level, but there was very little happening at the local level. Even in Syracuse, there was a men's wheelchair basketball program, and Syracuse was about an hour drive from my town. So not really, at that time, not something that was really possible. And I wasn't interested in playing with a group of adult men, frankly. That just didn't appeal to me as a 16-year-old in any way. So,
Cheri, what's your disability? When did you acquire it?
My disability is that I acquired a spinal cord injury actually very young, at 16 months of age. I was born and raised on a farm in Northwest Iowa, and was involved in a traumatic farming accident. Obviously, I don't have any memory of it. My earliest memories are of as being a disabled person, and self-identifying as having a disability, because that was really my only lived experience. So Ann and I have our lives have a lot of parallels.
What are some of those?
Just as Ann is telling her story, I'm smiling and nodding at pretty much every point she's making, because my experience was very similar. It sounds like she started college and started to discover some of those opportunities when I actually acquired my disability. But despite that, and despite there being, I don't know, probably, Ann, about an 18 or 20-year gap, I had many similar experiences. Growing up in a pretty rural community, the only option was public school. Everybody went to the same school that was actually K through 12, all under one roof. So everybody knew everybody. And I was the only student in the school with a visible disability. Everybody was kind and worked really hard to include me in activities, but I always felt pretty isolated, without having, a tribe or a community in my school. And so I actually, when I was going through like the latter part of elementary school and junior high, my mom actually, who I credit a lot to in terms of her, really being a fierce advocate and making sure that I had the opportunities I needed. But she sought out a wheelchair basketball program that was going on in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which was the nearest small city close to our farm. And it was a veterans program. So here she was taking me as this, probably at that time, 6th or 7th grade, young girl, wanting to expose me to sports. I tried it out a couple of times, and as a young girl, didn't really connect with it because it was all older men playing, and it really, wasn't a natural fit. So actually, I was very much turned off to sport by that experience, because I said, oh, this isn't for me. I'll do other things. I'll pursue other opportunities. And then when I got into 8th grade, I had just a really, fortunate moment when our high school track coach learned about the sport of wheelchair racing, because the state of Iowa had a wheelchair racing event in their state track meet. And so he came back to school and he told me he had seen this wheelchair racing event, and he encouraged me to go out for our high school track team. And I initially told him no, because my prior experiences had been negative. But he continued to ask me to do it and try to recruit me for the team. And eventually I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And I went out for the team in 9th grade. And again, I was the only student with a disability on the team. I got a jersey and started pushing laps, with my teammates. And actually, yet again, near the end of that track season, I was ready to quit because, I was still isolated. I wasn't really a part of an adaptive sport or parasport community, so to speak. But at the end of that track season, I went to this state meet. And there, when I rolled out onto the track, I immediately ran into several other teenage girls who also had disabilities, and found out that there was a wheelchair racing team that trained in Des Moines, Iowa on the weekends. And that was the hook, right? That finally got me really excited about it. Not because I dreamed of being a Paralympian, but because I wanted to be friends with these other adolescent girls who had visible disabilities, because I finally felt like I had found a community of people that I could truly relate to, and that, understood my challenges and growing up in this isolated community. So started to go to those practices, and within, several months, finally got a racing chair that fit appropriately. I also started in one that was way too big. It was a rental. Finally got an appropriate racing chair, and then only then started to actually truly learn the sport and develop talent in the sport. I think a common theme in our stories is that at that time, these were very much opportunities that you had to seek out and be very proactive and honestly lucky to find them. And that's something that I think is changing to some extent, and that we need to continue to evolve. It shouldn't be so hard to find these opportunities, but it was at that time, and it still is in many ways.
That's right.
So maybe we could talk about where we are today. because both of you are saying that there are improvements, but what are some of the barriers for disabled people getting introduced and actively participating in sports today?
I think Cheri touched on a few of them, being the quality and quantity of programs that are available. There are some real quality programs if you're looking for those, but you have to either relocate or travel long distances to participate on weekends and really make a lot of sacrifices, personally, professionally, and for families if we're talking about young people. But there definitely are more programs than there were in 1981 in the communities. And there's been a lot of really intentional work done to expand those opportunities. A couple of ways that has been done is through, Judy, you'll remember this from the Department of Education. There used to be an actual competitive grant program for local communities to apply for recreation and sports programming funds. So those programs, I think, were introduced initially in the Rehabilitation Act or one of the amendments. So had been around for about 30 years. And really, if you study the roots of many of the community-based programs and university-based programs around the country, they had their roots in getting those grants from the Department of Ed. And we tried to continue to keep those going for as long as we could, but they were eventually eliminated. Rehabilitation centers, medical institutions usually will try to do some type of programming. So if you live in or near, medium-sized cities with medical centers, there are opportunities there. I think we're also seeing, because of the work frankly, at the Paralympic level, which Cheri can talk more about, we're seeing more universities, training athletes and athletes with disabilities in swimming and track and field and other sports like that. And we're talking not specifically necessarily about wheelchair athletes, but blind athletes, athletes with amputations, competitive, serious athletes who are looking to make a national team. But going back to the community level just for a moment, I want to mention quickly the 1996 Paralympic Games in Atlanta. One of the legacies of those games was establishing an organization responsible for developing sport for youth at the community level. And the organization is BlazeSports, named after the mascot from the 96 games. And that network of local programs that got developed through funding and technical assistance has really gone on. Well, they went on to be chapters of US Paralympics and much more involved in building that pipeline, right? From community-based entry-level programming to getting athletes who are interested to more competitive elite programming along the pipeline. But there's still a lot more work to be done because we're really just scratching the surface of getting the folks who have qualifying Paralympic type disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So Cheri, what field are you in medicine? And the reason I'm asking you the question is, when do you start meeting disabled individuals? And also, you work in a very large medical institution. I'm wondering how healthcare providers are transmitting information, if there are, about the value of sports for disabled individuals.
Yeah, great question. So I'd say there are probably sort of two different facets of that. I am based in Harvard, or I'm based in Boston in the Harvard system, or the Mass General Brigham system. And specifically, I have a leadership role at the Spalding Rehab Network. So we are the rehabilitation arm of Mass General Brigham, which you're right, it's a massive healthcare system. And, with our position here in rehab, we have the ability to introduce certainly physical activity, but in general, but also sport to people at a very early point in their rehabilitation journey, and work really hard to do that, knowing that everyone has autonomy. Everyone, of course, gets to make their independent decision about whether they're interested in pursuing it. But at least people should know what their opportunities are. When an individual is here, say, having experienced a new spinal cord injury, or, we have a pediatric floor. So, a disability that they acquire in childhood, or a developmental disability, for example, we integrate sports exposure as part of their actual physical therapy and occupational therapy. So that's a really great opportunity. And I'd say that model exists at most of the major rehabilitation centers across the country. Now, that said, only a small proportion of people with disabilities interface formally with rehab, right?
Exactly.
So many people out there either are born with a disability but don't have access to formal rehab or don't seek it out, or acquire a disability in adulthood that doesn't, in our medical system here in the US, qualify you for rehabilitation, for formal rehab. And so there's still a large role to play for primary care physicians, pediatricians, those clinicians who are interfacing with everyone, with all comers, to be aware of the importance of sport and physical activity for people with disabilities, and the range of opportunities that are available, whether it's someone, who wants to simply do a workout video in their home to get their heart rate up a little bit, or someone who might someday aspire to be a Paralympian. And that spectrum is important and okay, right? Not everybody aspires to be a Paralympian, and that's fine, but we do know that for health, a baseline level of physical activity is really important for all of us. So I think the rehab sector honestly has it pretty nailed down. I think it's the broader health community and medical community that actually, where we need to do more work. There's some activity going on. For example, there's a large initiative run by the American College of Sports Medicine and several other partners that's called Exercise is Medicine. So trying to get thinking about exercise like as a prescription. So if you're a physician, that you should give everybody a prescription for exercise. And we, there's great partnerships through, for example, NCPAD, the National Center on Health, Physical Activity and Disability, which is down at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and Lakeshore, the Lakeshore Institute. And, they're partnering, for example, with this Exercise is Medicine initiative to try to bring, more disability expertise and disability awareness to these broader physical, kind of public health-based physical activity initiatives.
What role do you think Title IX has played, if any, in getting public schools and universities to do more in the area of disability?
Title IX of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act created the requirement that girls and women have equal access to all educational programs and curriculum, including extracurricular activities. And the women's sports community worked hard to make sure that the regulations for Title IX really spelled out the equal benefits that were needed to ensure girls and women were getting the same access to sports opportunities as boys and men. So that's had a real impact in the US broadly, Title IX has, because the percentage of women in C-suite executive positions, something like 80% of them played competitive sports or organized sports. And the benefits and the statistics demonstrate that this has been wildly successful and impactful. And so I was early beneficiary in the 1970s as a grade school non-disabled kid. There was after school sports, organized sports for me and for my peers. So we grew up playing sports, and those opportunities obviously continued up through middle school and high school and at the collegiate level because of the people who were, paving the foundation. If you had asked me how Title IX impacted my ability to have opportunities as a disabled young woman, I would have said, there really wasn't much of a benefit initially thinking about it, but looking back at it, Title IX, created leaders and teachers and, women working in the field who got it, who understood that girls and women with disabilities should have these opportunities. Parents, men and women who saw the benefits of Title IX through their wives, daughters, children, also recognized, well, of course, there's value in this for girls and women with disabilities as well. So I think lots of advocacy and opportunity happened in wheelchair sports. When I think about that specifically, so many of the people working at the grassroots level starting programs were women.
And Tatiana McFadden was, I believe, the first or one of the first young women to use Title IX when she was being denied equal opportunity to participate and practice in wheelchair racing when she was in high school, or was it younger?
It was high school. And actually, in her case, I believe they ended up using the Rehabilitation Act because that was most applicable to her, to the discrimination she was experiencing. However, the Women's Sports Foundation took interest in her case and provided some support behind it in terms of advocacy and gaining access, to people that they'd worked with, and also, some staff support in it.
And Ann, maybe could you, because I know you were directly involved, so I feel like you can speak to it better than me, but do you want to talk a little bit about the Department of Ed and a Dear Colleague letter from 2013 as well?
Yeah, sure. With the McFadden case in the state of Maryland, specifically, that is where her case was heard, and she was awarded the opportunity to compete alongside her non-disabled teammates in track competitions. So after that law passed, we started working at the federal level, and I worked for a federal affairs consulting firm. So I was actually working on the case with one of the Women's Sports Foundation staff. So we designed an advocacy campaign to get this change at the federal level, and were successful in getting a GAO report, which requires research and analysis of what's happening in the field. The GAO staff went out and interviewed, teachers, principals, students, parents across the country to understand the situation. So basically what that GAO report did was provide evidence that there was no equity. In fact, there was very, very limited opportunity for students with disabilities in extracurricular sports or physical education, quality physical education. So that provided the impetus for us to go to the Department of Education and ask them to send a Dear Colleague letter reminding schools of their responsibility under the Rehab Act. The regulation says that students with disabilities have equal access to all educational programs, including extracurricular sports or extracurricular activities, which is what sports fall under. So that letter took a while because we had a change in administration, and under the Obama administration, the Department of Ed finally issued a letter. They didn't call it a Dear Colleague letter because that's a very specific type of document, but it was a letter that went to every school, K through 12, and I believe also higher education institutions. Although I think the focus was on K through 12, but it certainly sent a message to higher education that they were going to be expected to follow requirements under the Rehab Act as well. And Cheri, you know, living with Eli, who's an expert on these issues, how that has the implementation process and what that's looked like.
If I could say before, Cheri, you mentioned a little more about this. I know for our audience, we're getting a little bit into the weeds, but let me just say that I think this is really important to understand that there are a series of laws that have been put in place over the last, I'm getting emotional, over the last 40, 50 years, that while it takes a long time for things to really get implemented, when people like Ann and Cheri and Eli and many others get involved to really understand the importance in this case of athletics, the discrimination that has existed historically, the ability to look at how to break it down. And as you can see, there are many, many, many different steps. And I think that's ultimately what we're all needing to look at, is what is our objective here? We're talking about sports, but it really doesn't matter what the area is. What do we need to do? What is in place already? And how can we strengthen what's in place? So you want to talk a brief bit about Eli, because I want to get more also into discussing your roles in the Paralympics. Go ahead, Cheri.
Of course. Yeah. So my better half, Eli Wolf. So he and I met through the Paralympics. I was a wheelchair racer, and he was a soccer player in the sport of soccer 7-a-side, which is designed for athletes with cerebral palsy. I work in the medical field, but he has stayed involved in sport, and particularly, the aspects of sport that, include reaching underserved communities. So women in sport, disabled people in sport, other rights-based issues in sport. And he and a tremendous group of advocates. I mean, frankly, I feel like we're all involved, and you've been involved too. I pitch in a lot too. I mean, it's to your point, Judy, it's everybody plays a role, but there's been a lot of work in thinking about, how do we then, take this legislation and the policy and something like the Rehab Act and help to elevate understanding, and then help to elevate implementation. Because sure, it's great to have the legal protections and to know that a student like Tatiana can file suit if needed to protect her rights. But, we want to have these programs more broadly available as the standard, right? Rather than having to have it always have to be a fight. And really where we're at is that states are in different levels of progress, I would say, and Ann, please jump in anytime. This move towards implementation is in different levels in different parts around the places around the country. In states that are doing well, there's been an identification of the need to elevate this work through their Interscholastic Athletic Association. Like here in Massachusetts, it's called the MIAA, or the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association. And that's the state-led organization that connects to every school in the whole state and provides like the standards and policy for the implementation of sports programs in those schools. And they do a lot of policy setting. They do a lot of coaching training. They really are sort of the organization that sets priorities. And so in some states where there's a lot of progress, the Athletic Association will get involved in doing things like coaching training and upskilling sports staff to be prepared to work with students with disabilities and to understand their obligations. And there may be a few champion schools, right, who do a great job of starting a program and identifying students who may be well served by the program. And then those schools provide an example for others, right? And the sort of network begins to spread. There are certain sports where integration is really not difficult. I think the best examples are individual sports like track and field and swimming, where it's so easy. I mean, it's a pretty low barrier to integrate a student with a disability onto the team and to think about any adjustments to the training that might be needed to accommodate that student. And then everybody trains and competes together. Whereas other sports, specifically team sports like wheelchair basketball, for example, it's a little harder because any given school may not have enough students with disabilities to fill a whole team. And then you may need to think about different models. So for example, maybe a school district brings together a team and competes against other districts. And then I also want to say, there's also a model, of course, where some students with disabilities may simply completely integrate into a team and not need accommodations as well. So for example, an amputee runner or a student with who's legally blind, or a student who is deaf, where accommodations may be quite minimal, and it's important to just ensure that that student has access. So there's different models for different sports. Every state is in a bit of a different place in terms of how much they've prioritized it from the standpoint of raising awareness with athletic departments, training coaches, training teachers, and creating that expectation. But things are changing slowly but surely. I think that advocates, sometimes wish that there would be a bit more, something like a Title IX, right, where there was more of a immediate requirement to just do it rather than more of this sort of phased rollout. It'll be interesting to see how that develops over the next several years.
I mean, I would quite frankly presume that the way it's operating now is not the way it should. that it should be a just do it. Because if you look at Title IX, I'm sure in the beginning it was really pressure, but I think over time it's no longer pressure, it's a just do it. Let's move forward and talk about the roles that you've both played on the national and international levels with the International Paralympic Committee. So what have both of your experiences been in being involved with the IPC? And I think your role, Cheri, has been different than Ann's role. So Cheri, you want to talk a little bit about your role?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. My roles have evolved a little bit over the years. I mean, clearly my earliest involvement was as an athlete. And, you know, competing over many years. I competed internationally for about 10 years, from about 1998 to 2008, participated in 3 Paralympics in Sydney, Athens, and Beijing. And over that period of time, it was really, if I look back, it was really incredible to see the growth of the Paralympic movement, even from the lens of being an athlete. You know, my first international competition in 98, you know, we barely had a jacket that said USA on it. We had everybody had to pay for their own flight and accommodations. It was really, you know, you could compete, but it's all on you. And by the time I retired from international competition in 2008, there was a lot more work towards, you know, integration and recognition of the Paralympic component of the sport under our US programming. And you know, more directionality towards equity of experience, although there was still a long way to go at that time, but it was much better, and tremendous growth over those years. When I retired from competing, you know, I very quickly recognized, even that as I was contemplating retirement, that sport was such an integral part of my life journey and my identity that you know, there was no way I could just hang up my racing gloves and turn away and never be a part of it again. So I started to immediately scheme about how I could stay involved. And at that time, I was a medical student. So it was natural to think about staying involved from the lens of like sports medicine or contributing on the medicine and health front. So in that same time frame as I was retiring, the IPC actually at that time, Ann was on the board. So thank you, Ann. Made a decision that every standing committee of the IPC should have an athlete representative. And so there are very few Paralympic athletes around the world who also had careers in medicine. So because of that alignment, I was able to join that committee as the athlete rep. And that was really the start of my journey towards being involved in more leadership roles. You know, that was really an incredible opportunity for me because I got to then, you know, travel to the IPC headquarters and sit around a table with other decision makers and start to weigh in on things like, you know, medical policies and things that we needed to be doing to promote athlete health. And I still serve on that committee today. So, you know, I've continued to stay involved. These days, interestingly, more and more, so much of what we do is aligned with the Olympic movement because, you know, the things that are helpful to promote athlete health in the Olympics are similarly important in the Paralympics. I think the best example is more attention to athlete mental health, right? And the importance of thinking about athletes' health holistically and knowing that, you know, winning is important, but winning the right way is really important, and ensuring that our athletes come out of their competitive experience, you know, feeling like it was positive for their well-being, and that we, you know, supported their mental health as well as their physical health through that journey. And then more recently, over the last now 6-7 years, that involvement at the international level with the IPC on the medical side sort of expanded and through a number of different, I guess you could say, entry points, I ended up getting more involved back in the US and ultimately in 2017 joined the board of the US, at that time, US Olympic Committee, which is now changed its name to the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And that's been yet another facet of leadership involvement that actually isn't medically focused at all. There's, you know, a tiny bit that touches on medical, but it's actually far more broad, and looking at really the growth of the whole Olympic and Paralympic movement here in the US. And I'm really just, incredibly honored and proud to be in that role. And I think one of the coolest things about it is that I'm not there as like the Paralympic rep, right? I'm just there to be able to weigh in on everything that we do as an organization. And a lot of my success I owe to the early leadership that Ann provided. So she should talk about her experience too.
And you've been at the State Department now for a number of years. How have you, just give me one example of how you've used your experiences, your lifelong experiences, Paralympic participation being one of them, but so many other areas to really help advance Paralympics around the world?
So thank you for that question. When I started at the State Department, I worked in the sports diplomacy division, and I had the opportunity to create a program around disability and sport. So there was an existing mentoring program that we had for girls and women, and it really was having a lot of early impact and success. And I knew that it was exactly the type of program that we needed and would benefit from in the Paralympic movement. So I worked to create a global sports mentoring program focused on sport for persons with disabilities. And we really incorporated a rights-based approach as well. So that program brings in, it started the first cohort, or the first class, was in 2016. And we usually have somewhere between 15 and 20 participants, emerging leaders from the disability sports world from all over the world, come to the US for 4 to 5 weeks for a mentorship program, and to really develop and hone skills and expertise in organizing events, managing, promoting, fundraising, all areas of sport development, from the local level even to the Paralympic level, if that's what people are aiming towards. So there's an amazing network of emerging leaders who, many of them are in leadership positions now, especially the earlier folks, and they connect with each other across years and across programs.
Thank you both very much. We're coming to an end, so I have one quick question for both of you. What do you want to see in the next 5 to 10 years in the area of Paralympics?
First off, we are hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles in 2028. And so by 2028, by the time the Paralympics opening ceremonies happen in Los Angeles, I want every person in the United States to know what the Paralympics is, and to know, what it represents, the fact that it's the pinnacle of elite sport for people with disabilities, and that following under that, there's a whole, of course, it's like the tip of the pyramid, but there's a whole pyramid that's under that in terms of people involved at the school level and people involved recreationally, some of them whom, end up at the Paralympics. So awareness of the movement, I think it would be a big goal from my perspective. Awareness drives everything else, right? You can't be it until you can see it. So for so many young people, knowing what the movement is, and someday aspiring to engage in the movement, whether at the recreational level or the elite level, that would be my vision. And then ubiquitous opportunities in schools.
Ann.
Yeah, I'm with you on the 2028 games and the opportunities that presents for us. I also want to see the Paralympic movement recognized as the social change movement. We're demonstrating leadership in this area. We have leadership expertise and a history of this kind of work. And I think it's about telling these stories, connecting people from different generations, and really engaging the entirety of the Paralympic movement in this social change work, because it's a powerful network, excuse me.
So I want to thank both of you, and we will, as we always do, have information at the end of the program to allow people to learn more about some of the organizations that you've been discussing. And as one who never participated in athletic activities except to be an observer, Although when I was in Brazil, I learned about bocce for quadriplegics. So the games are really advancing. In my view, there are opportunities for everybody with various forms of disability. I think what we've learned today is that sports is very important for everyone. And we really want to ensure that disabled individuals, their families, and educators and healthcare providers understand that participation for disabled people is as important as for non-disabled people. So thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you, Judy.
Judy.
History won't forget us or try to minimize our pain.